Imagine your history as a timeline. How many highs and lows have you experienced? Joys, pain, overcoming problems, obstacles. And the truth is that the line is not that linear. There are several factors, internal and external, that influence all the time our journey. And they are single, exclusive, and complexes. And what if are we responsible for one stimuli that can influence a whole life? And what if we created the opportunity of minimizing the differences and change a trajectory? We believe that yes, that is possible. And that is why since 2003, we support inspiring projects with the objective of incentivizing the social protagonism. We think we can generate impact today, so happier versions of this story can be written in a close near future. Instituto CPFL, energy that transforms realities. Good evening. We are starting a new recording of Café Filosófico CPFL, and I would like to thank everyone that is here in Campinas for the shooting, and everyone who are watching us on Instagram and YouTube. And I would like to tell you to follow us on YouTube and have access to 20 years of the schedule and also the future program. This is Café Filosófico CPFL. So, we have today at Café Filosófico CPFL, Claudia Trevisan, the Executive Director of the Business Council of Brazil-China, graduated in law by USP and in journalism at PUC São Paulo, and she works as a journalist since 1987, where she was a international correspondent in Argentina, Brazil, and China, and she wrote China, the Rebirth of the Empire, and the Chinese. So let's welcome our guest with a round of applause. Good evening, everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be with you here at Café Filosófico CPFL to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is China. And I think the first thing that comes to mind about China is that China is a country of superlatives. Starting with its population, China has a population of 1.4 billion people, which corresponds to almost 20% of humanity, or 7 Brazils. And when we look at the past of China, the superlative character is even more evident. China is the country with the longest continuous history in the world, with at least 3,500 years. So in the modern age, it is responsible for one of the main inventions of the humanity, like paper, the compass, the gunpowder, and the press before Gutenberg. China also has the longest bureaucratic tradition in the world. It started with exams to select their government employees in the mandarins in the empire in the 7th century. And China has the Great Wall with 21,000 kilometers, which is the longest engineering work in the world. So from different angles, Imperial China was a more sophisticated and richest country than Europe. If we look at the crystal era from the year 1 until the beginning of the 19th century, China and India were the largest economies in the world. And in the beginning of the 19th century, it was the largest economy in the world, with a GDP that would be around 30% of the world GDP, which is more than the participation of the USA today, which is around 27%. But the scenario changed radically in the 19th century with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the emerging of the British Empire. China didn't realize the world had changed radically and resisted to the pressures of the British Crown to open its market to the British products. And that led to the Opium War, where China lost in 1842. And as one of the penalties, China transferred to England the control of Hong Kong. And so the mid-19th century starts the period of lack of aggregation and invasion of China by foreign powers, the impoverishment of the country. China is invaded by Japan in the 30s. Japan just leaves China after losing the Second World War. And the moment China goes back to its civil war between communists and nationalists, and the communists win in 1949. And China calls this period, mid-19th to mid-20th century, the century of humiliation. This preface is important to understand the vision the Chinese leaders have now of their place in the world. I'm not going to talk about the Imperial China. I'm going to talk about the China for the last 4.5 decades, where China decided to open to the world, adopt market rules, and what would start a transformation that has no precedents in terms of speed and in terms of scale. That change starts in 78, when Deng Xiaoping emerged as the new leader of China after an internal war of power that preceded the death of Mao Tsé-tung in 1976. At that period, China was isolated, poor, and the state had a completely dominating role in its economy. In December 78, Deng Xiaoping was able to get the approval of the Communist Party in the process of reform and opening that would lead China to the position of second largest economy in the world 3 decades later. So China takes this position in 2010. And Deng Xiaoping abandoned the ideological strictness that was part of the previous decades and took a pragmatic position that's reflected in one phrase that's famous for him, that it says, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mouse. So he knew that for modernizing, China needed capital and technology coming from developed countries, especially the USA. So 3 days before the beginning of the party's meeting, the Communist Party's meeting that would approve the reforms, China and the USA announced their normalization of their diplomatic affairs. And the first country Xiaoping visited after the Congress, this meeting, was the USA. And we are going to see here a picture of this meeting between Deng and then the then president of the USA, Jimmy Carter. And something I like to highlight is that China decided to change its economy and open up for the world way before the fall of the Wall of Berlin, which would happen in 1989, and the Soviet Union ended in 1991. And in this process, the Communist Party in China got stronger and more sophisticated, while the Soviet Union Party lost its relevance. And for us to have an idea of the size of the transformation that China was about to start, it is important to remember that in 1978, 82% of the Chinese population lived in the rural areas, and there you had a collectivization system where the land was used collectively by the inhabitants. In the cities, jobs were offered by state companies. China had a single bank, the People's Bank of China. There was no commercial banks in China. And in the cities, bicycles were the main thing you could see. It's difficult to imagine that now. And now you can see this image that shows China in 78, in March 78. And you can see the amount of bicycles, and the wardrobe was very similar, was very limited. And on that poster in the back, you see long live Marxism, Leninism, and the Mao Zedong thinking. And in these 4.5 decades, the transformations are not measured from one generation to another. It's not the son that says, oh, my dad has a life like that, and my life is completely different. The same person lived in completely different Chinas. If I were Chinese, I would have spent my childhood during the Cultural Revolution, an extremely difficult period of China's history, where its fabric was really drastically complicated. I would have reached my adult life in the beginning of the reform process, and I would have seen the country transform in an unbelievable way every few years. And to understand what happened since 1978, it's important to split this period in 4 great phases and say that the reform in China was not one big bang. So let's change, let's privatize everything. No, the reform was gradual and based in experimentation. China tried experiences, and the ones that worked were replicated inside the country. And there is another phrase from Xiaoping that reflects a lot of that. So it's crossing the river, feeling the stones. So the first phase is a phase that goes from 78 to the beginning of the 90s. And in this phase, the government loosens the economic ties, and the reform starts by the rural area, and the families of the farmers are authorized to grow some lots of land individually and sell the exceeding production in the market price. In the cities, some new, the first companies, the private companies start to show. So people could have few employees, so there were family companies that started to expand, and the private sector transformed into a very important engine for China's growth. And in 1980, China created its first special economic zone in Shenzhen, in the south of China, in a strategic position because it's close to Hong Kong. At the time, it was still part of the British it was a British colony, but it was a financial center that was very important in this process of reform and opening of China. And in those special economic zones, there were some different rules from the ones that would rule the other parts of China in terms of contracts, in how you would address capital and working relations, profit. And the objective was to attract foreign investors. The idea of Xiaoping that China needed capital and technology from other countries, and its main capital was its abundant and cheap workforce. And so I'd like to call the reading of a text that shows a little bit about Shenzhen and how it worked in this initial time of the reform and the creation of the special economic zones. Shenzhen was a city for the young. There were fortunes to be made if you could reinvent yourself fast enough and were willing to take risks. Young people in Shenzhen looked to the British colony of Hong Kong just across the border for their fashion tips, swapping their simple blue Mao-style tunics for fashionable Western black suits and scandalous short skirts with tights. At night, they would discreetly fix fishbone antennas on rooftops to watch uncensored Hong Kong television programs, then remove them in the morning to avoid punishment. They took pride in their sophistication, referring to the rest of China as the interior. An ever-growing number of them were getting the opportunity to study abroad, return fluent in foreign languages, and armed with the latest technical training. After Shenzhen, many other special economic zones were created. Among them, one of the most famous ones is Pudong in Shanghai, which today has the most famous skyline in China. And we can see this image from Pudong. And what really impresses me in this picture is the fact that Pudong is the part on the other side of the river, and the fact that nothing of that existed up to 1990, which is the year the special economic zone is created in Pudong. Today, Pudong has a GDP that represents around 10% of the Brazilian GDP, and that tallest building you're seeing is the tallest in China and the third tallest one in the world. The second phase of the reform goes from the beginning of the 90s up to the beginning of the 2000s, 2001, when China enters the World Trade Organization, which is the moment where the state retracts a little bit. And so China as of 95, it privatized or closed around 30 and 100,000 state companies, and it was a harmful process. 40 million Chinese lost their jobs. And in this phase, the leadership in China went deeper into the market reforms, meeting the demands and the requirements for it to be accepted in the World Trade Organization. During that time, the leadership in China used the market socialist economy to define the economic model they were creating. It is an economic model in which the market has a role in allocating resources, but the state still has an influence on the definition of the strategic guidelines of the country. And so the third phase starts with China entering the WTO in 2001 and goes up to 2012 when Xi Jinping gets to the power. This is the period of the Chinese boom, when China really embraces globalization and paves the way to become the factory of the world. And this period from 2002 to 12, the annual growth in China was 10.4% on average. So it became one of the main destinations of foreign investments in the world. In 2009, it took the position of the largest exporter in the planet. It was during that time that China entered my life, in the life of Brazil, and most of the world. In 2003, I worked in São Paulo as a reporter for the newspaper Folha de São Paulo, and I started paying attention at the speed of the transformation of China. Up to then, China was something remote, distant, that wasn't really part of our day by day. And I started to notice that China was growing in high rates and that its relevance for the foreign trade in Brazil was growing too. In 2000, China was the 12th destination for the Brazilian exports. Brazil sold to China in 2000 $1.1 billion. 3 years later, in 2003, it was the third destination for Brazilian exports with $4.5 billion. And in 2009, it went over the US and Argentina became the main destination for Brazilian exports. In 2004, we sold to China $94 billion, 85 times what it had sold in 2000. So after getting interested by China in 2003, I moved to Beijing in 2004 to be a correspondent. And when I got to China in 2004, China was the sixth economy in the world. It was behind the US, Japan, Germany, England, and France.
In 2005, China surpassed France. In 2006, England. In 2007, Germany. And in 2010, China surpassed Japan and became the second biggest economy in the world, which it's still its current position. This is the period when business people gain permission to join the Communist Party. And in 2004, we had the three first billionaires in China. And I remember that I was, as a reporter there, I did reports on that. And one of the characteristics of the new billionaires and the new rich is that everyone was newly rich. They didn't have rich people in China until then. And today, China has the second highest number of billionaires in the world, behind only the US. This is also a period of very, very rapid urbanization. So the landscape in China was changing within months. And streets that you used to know no longer existed. Buildings were disappearing and others were built in their place. And I do have some images of my neighborhood. This was the area when I lived in Beijing. My building was already built, but I was basically in a construction site. We have this other picture as well. And the next picture, because the landscape in China at the time was basically dominated by cranes and construction equipment, and they were huge construction sites. It wasn't just one or two buildings, but real complexes with a lot of buildings within them. And then we move on to the fourth phase in China, talking about this transformation period. And this period starts in 2012 with the coming of Xi Jinping into power, and it's still going on today. This phase has the main characteristic of basically a reduction in the economic growth. Economic growth is no longer double digit at this point. From 2002 to 2012, the average growth in China was around 6%. And in 2004, 2005, it gets much closer to 5%. However, the Chinese economy today is much bigger than it was on the previous phase. So China's GDP today is $18 trillion. So that's 9 times the Brazilian GDP. And when an economy that is worth $18 trillion is growing 5% a year, it is adding to their GDP the equivalent to 2 Argentinas. This phase saw the consolidation of China as a leader in global industrial production. So China became the world's factory. In 1995, China was responsible for 4.9% of industrial production in the world. China was in fourth place behind the US, Japan, and Germany. In 2010, China reached the second position at around 15.6%. The US was still in the lead. In the next year, China surpassed the US and got to 20%. And in 2003, China already had 32% of the world's industrial production, more than double than the US had at 15%. And the biggest news in this phase, the biggest novelty, compared to the previous ones, is the biggest emphasis in the quality of the growth and not as much the quantity of the growth. And also looking for new economic engines and new drivers that could take the country and further. And these are very based on technology and innovation. There is actually a change in thinking, and innovation becomes a central pillar of the planning. And over the last decade, China came and became a global leader in a lot of technologies that are going to define the economy in the future. So China today has a position that is really remarkable in digital payment, internet platforms, robotics, quantum computing, blockchain, Internet of Things, and artificial intelligence. Today, China is the greatest competitor to the US in terms of innovation and technology. And also, China has a dominating position in technology related to the decarbonization process and the energy transition. The Chinese leaders have transformed the climate emergency into a big world issue, and they were able to transform and make the country the number one leader in wind energy, solar energy, electrical batteries, and electrical cars. China is today the country that is investing the most in broadening renewable energy sources. In 2024, 60% of the investments, the green investments performed in the world, were actually done by China. Ever since 2020, China has tripled its installed capacity to generate wind and solar energies. And around the 1,500 gigawatts. Do you have an idea of how much that is? Just so you know, the entire country of Brazil, with all of its energy sources, has a capability of install generation that is just over 200 gigawatts. China was also responsible in 2024 by 60% of the sales of electrical cars globally, and BYD actually surpassed Tesla and became the number one company of electrical cars in the world. And China is also responsible for 70% of the production of the batteries that are used in electrical cars. China, even though it has a 1.4 billion population, China is the country that is installing the most industrial robots in the world. In 2023, China surpassed both Germany and Japan in the ranking of number of industrial robots per 10,000 workers. China is currently only behind South Korea and Singapore. And there's a new phenomenon in China actually that is starting to spread, which are the dark factories. So they are completely automatized factories. They don't have humans, therefore they are basically lights out manufacturing. They don't need any kind of illumination. And China has invested a lot in the development of humanoid robots. So they look like humanoid, they look like humans, and there are schools of training for humanoid robots that can in the future play a lot of roles by supporting people. especially when we talk about the elderly people in China, and we will talk about that in a little bit and the demographic change that is happening. And I would like to bring up the reading of a text by Kai-Fu Lee. He is an entrepreneur and investor in the technology sector, and he had a lot of exposure to the Silicon Valley in the US, but also to the innovation ecosystem in China. And basically, he talks about what the system is like in China. I have spent decades deeply immersed in both Silicon Valley as well as China's tech scene, working at Apple, Microsoft, and Google before incubating and investing in dozens of Chinese startups. I can say that Silicon Valley seems quite slow compared to its competitor on the other side of the Pacific. China's successful internet entrepreneurs have reached where they are by thriving in the most ruthless competitive environment on the planet. They live in a world where speed is essential. Copying is an accepted practice, and competitors spare no effort to dominate a new market. Every day spent in China's startup scene is a trial by fire, comparable to a gladiator's day in the Colosseum. Well, talking a little bit about the idea and this idea of how China is a remarkable superlative country, I wanted to talk a little bit about this process, especially from the 2000s. China built an enviable infrastructure, and this exact infrastructure is what allowed for the economic growth. Basically, it led to growth and created the foundation for this growth to happen. And it allowed for China to become the world's factory and also the biggest exporter in the world. And I'm going to mention a few examples. 7 out of the 10 biggest ports in the world are in China. 5 out of the 10 longest bridges in the world are also in China. The highest extension of subway lines are in China. China has the biggest network of 5G in the world with 1 billion users, 1 billion people who access the 5G network. And they've already started developing 5.5G, which is going to be essential for the development of artificial intelligence. China has the longest high-speed train lines with almost 50,000 kilometers, which is more than every other country in the world combined. And I wanted to show a picture here. This is a picture of the Shanghai train station. This is a huge train station, and basically it's where the high-speed trains leave and come to. And the next picture is the inside of a train that I was in May when I was in China. And here you can see the speed. It was around 290 kilometers per hour. And China is already developing trains that now go at around 400 kilometers per hour or more. The distance between Beijing and Shanghai is 1,200 kilometers. And with the train, you can make this trip in 4 hours and 10 minutes. Just to have an idea, the distance between São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro is 430 kilometers, and we take almost 6 hours for this entire drive by car. And now I wanted to talk a little bit about the most important geopolitical dispute of the 21st century, which is the competition between the United States and China. And this competition is a competition that basically seeks technological superiority. It's a competition for technology, for innovation. And since the US got to the position of the biggest economy in the world, which was at the end of the 19th century, when the US surpassed England and in 1870 became the highest economy, the biggest economy in the world, the US has never faced a rival like China. The biggest rival that the US had in the 20th century was the Soviet Union. However, the relationship of the Soviet Union with the world is very different than the situation that we see in China. firstly, the GDP, China's GDP compared to the US's GDP, in 1980, China's GDP was 11% of the US's GDP. In 2024, this was around 65% of the US's GDP. The Soviet Union has never gotten even close to 60% of the American GDP. Other than that, the Soviet Union was not a region that was integrated to the global economy outside of the Iron Curtain countries. And the economic relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States was very small. There wasn't a lot of economical engagement between the two. And today, China is the biggest commercial partner of 2/3 of the countries in the world and is the third biggest commercial partner of the United States themselves. So there is an integration between the two countries that has never existed before when we think about the Soviet Union. You have the big American companies. When we think about the biggest, so we have Apple, one of the most valuable countries in the world. It was actually until Nvidia came around. And Apple is only Apple because of China. Apple built in China due to their infrastructure, this remarkable infrastructure that China offers. Apple built in China a logistics, a production logistics that is extremely efficient and that they're not going to be able to reproduce anywhere else in the world. So 95% of iPhones are actually manufactured in China. Starbucks has more stores. I mean, anywhere else in the world, the second highest number of stores and Starbucks stores are in China. There was a time when General Motors was selling more cars in China than in the United States. So it truly is a situation that is very different than what we saw previously. And I think that for the rest of the world and for us, it's truly a big loss if we have, these two countries that are very interconnected, and it will be a loss if they cannot find a way to coexist. Because we're talking about the two biggest economies in the world. And of course, the rest of the world, the rest of the countries in the world maintain very strong relationship with, and no countries, so Brazil, no countries in Asia or Latin America, they don't want to choose between China and the United States. I believe that the best scenario would truly be for there to be a coexistence, Pacific coexistence agreement between the two countries. And China, other than this point related to innovation, they have the other attributes of a big power. They are one of the 5 members of the UN's Security Council. They do have the right to veto, together with the United States, Russia, England, and France. They've had nuclear weapons since 1964. And they also have the second most advanced space program in the world. And they are the only country that have an independent space station. But there is something that hasn't changed in China over the last 4.5 decades, which is the central role of the Chinese Communist Party. This entire transformation that we've seen over the last 4 decades, they have been thought of and conducted by the Communist Party. And this is a quote by Xi Jinping. Party, government, army, civilians, and academics, north, south, east, west, and center. The party leads everything. I lived in China for a year as a correspondent for the Folha de São Paulo newspaper until 2005. And then I went back to China in 2008 as a correspondent to another newspaper, O Estado de São Paulo. And I was working there at the time when there was the Congress of the Communist Party in 2012, in which Xi Jinping was selected as the new leader for the party. And I wanted to show a picture This is the inside of the big People's Palace. And here in the first row, we have the main leaders in China. And the next picture is the moment when Xi Jinping, he's the one that is speaking in the picture, and six other men, they were presented to the press as the new Chinese leadership. So these seven people here in the picture would integrate the standing committee of the Politburo, which is the highest governing body of China. And the Xi Jinping's ambition is to accomplish what he calls the Chinese dream. And then we basically connect ourselves again to the beginning of what I said and thinking about the glorious past of China. And I would like to invite a reading from Sharma Bubani. He is a retired diplomat from Singapore, and he knows both China and the US deeply.
In the arena of civilization dynamics, the world is reverting to something like the historic equilibrium among the major human civilizations. For more than 2 centuries, Western civilization enjoyed preponderance over the rest, enabling it to reverse the historical norm. From AD 1 until about 1820, China and India were the largest civilizations in economic terms. The past 200 years have thus been an anomaly. One reason the West no longer dominates is that the rest have learned so much from it, having absorbed many of its best practices in economic policy, political governance, scientific research, and technological innovation. As a result, while parts of the Western world, particularly Europe, now seem exhausted, lacking drive and energy, other civilizations are only beginning to heat up in this sense. These civilizations are like living organisms with life cycles. China's civilization has seen many ups and downs, and it's unsurprising that it is now on the rise again. But it doesn't mean that China doesn't have any challenges ahead of it. It doesn't. It has many. And as I said, the economy is decelerating, and the Communist Party needs to find new drives for growth. The government promoted a disinflation in the real estate sector for assessing that it was supersized. And there was a moment they started representing a systemic risk. And as of 2021, there was in the real estate engine, it decreased the amount of launch, the square meter that was built, it was reduced by half. And China, its main bet, the main discussion there is today in China is how to increase the domestic consumption in terms of, in a moment that exports are facing commercial barriers, especially in the US, which is the main market for China. And that's going to demand a new round of reforms. Because to consume more, the Chinese needs to be incentivized to save less, so it demands more social support and protection, stronger than what there is today. Another vulnerability in China is that despite the technological advances, China depends on the chips it imports. It imports more chips than oil, and it is the number one oil importer in the world. And it depends on the most advanced chips that are the ones used for AI training. So that became clear in the case of DeepSeek that launched its new language model in January 2025 on the day of Donald Trump's inauguration. And that shook all the stock markets in the world because it's a language model that uses less financial and technological resources and gets comparable results to the ones from the American competitors. But DeepSeek trained its AI with NVIDIA chips that today is the main producer of AI chips and was the first company in history to reach a market value of $4 trillion, which is double the Brazilian GDP. Another challenge is the demography. The Chinese population is decreasing and aging more faster than the country leaders expected. So the country ended the policy of a single child in 2001. But even so, the families are not having more children. The fertility rate in China is one child per woman, which is lower than the regain of the population level. And in 2023, China lost to India the position of the most populous nation in the world. And last year, the population shrinked in 1.4 million people, and the number of Chinese with 60 or more years old reached 310 million, which is double the level in 2006. And the per capita income is 1/6 of the per capita income in the USA. But the last 4.5 decades say that we shouldn't underestimate the capacity of the government in China to see problems and have strategies to face them. And to continue with our conversation, I'd like to invite to the stage Yili Wang, my Chinese teacher, a great teacher, and she's the one that gave me my Chinese name, Konglangji, and I asked Felipe to introduce her. So thank you, Claudia. So let's call to the stage Yili Wang, who has an MBA for COPEAD. She studied English in Harvard and works as a translator and interpreter for the governments of China and Brazil. She is also the author of the bilingual book Vai Ver Se Eu Estou na China. She is a Mandarin teacher. She runs the language school called Oi China and is one of the Chinese influencers, the most famous in Brazil, with over 1.5 million followers in social media. So let's invite her to the stage with a round of applause. She said hi. So I think I need a translator. I'm very happy to be here today with my student, Blanji, which is me, to talk about China. And I'm also very happy that in the audience we have many students of mine that are here to see Café. So, round of applause for Lanji for her Mandarin. Yili, I just mentioned the demography in China and the matter of the single child policy. You are a single child. You are from a generation of single children, of only children in China. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the experience of being in a country where everyone is an only child. And tell us, try to explain why people are not having more children despite the absence of the policy. As Claudia said, this policy of a single child lasted 36 years from the 80s to 2016. I was born in the 90s. I'm an only child, and all my closest friends are only children. And a curious thing that happens is that we don't have siblings, and so we call our cousins siblings. So we consider our cousins, our brothers and sisters and their parents, we call uncle, aunt. The family ends up having this different change. And I, as a single child, I received all the attention of my family and all the material resources and a lot of investment on me, especially in the educational part, which is a habit that the Chinese family have. And that explains, as Claudia asked, why Chinese people don't want to have more children. Because all the Chinese family invest a lot in education. We consider education as one of the reasons why China could get to a more technological revolutionary path. So today, before on the path, I was talking to Claudia in Mandarin and I shared with her, I asked her, did you know that normally an ordinary family in China invests 30 to 50% of our income in the children's education? And there is a statistic that say that as of the child be born until they graduate at university, a common family would invest around 700 to 1 million reais. So it is a considerable amount of money, and we want the best to our children. And it ends up that we need to have more money, work more to take care of them. And young people today, we have a saying that says, a more modern saying that says, children need to start competing from the starting point. So there was some courses, extracurricular courses and trainings. So I went to a Chinese wedding very recently, a friend of mine, and the main topic during our 3 days there was to try to convince him and his wife to have a child, because on the day of their wedding, he said, we don't want to have children because raising a child is very expensive. He is one of my best friends in Shanghai. I was born and grew up in Shanghai, and investing in education is expensive, and because the whole family really want to do that. So in between investing and not investing and giving a better condition to a child or not, people are thinking, well, we should wait. And of course, at the same time, I'm sorry, but Chinese women they have more independence. We look for independency in our careers. And as Claudia mentioned, the billionaire entrepreneurs in China that are coming up. And today, if I'm not mistaken, China is the country with most millionaire women is starting their career from scratch, who are not heirs. So as a Chinese woman, I think it's very admirable. I don't know if one day I'll get to be a millionaire as them, but that's the reality today. And yes, I believe the woman's position in China has drastically changed, and you can see entrepreneurial women, women in management position. It's something very impressive. And the matter of the competition too. Poor children, right? Because it's very difficult, really. And at the time of a single child, there was an investment, but also the child was the bearer of the expectations of a father, a mother, and four grandparents. And another way that there could be as an only child is when our parents get older. We know when we get married, we know we're going to have four elderly people and a child for us. So we have to take care of five people at the same time. So yes, and that's when the humanoid robots get into the scene, because China is investing a lot and thinking about who is going to take care of all the elderly people in China. One of these days I was listening about these robots because China is building robots to be caretakers for elderly, to help them get up from bed and all that. And continuing still with the robots and going to the digital world, I think that who goes to China gets into a digital world that is different from us. And the Chinese people use the payment methods, digital payment way before we had Pix in Brazil, you rarely see money in paper. So the Chinese got from money to QR code. They kept credit cards, and I think it is the same for many other technologies. China went from not having phones for having mobile phones, for not having any internet connection to have a very good internet connection. So people use a lot the internet to order food, to buy online. The e-commerce is huge in China. So tell us a little bit about this digital universe in China and how is the interaction of the Chinese and the digital world. When we talk about China, I would like to highlight one advance in Brazil in this matter of pigs. I think this was an amazing invention that really helped us. And if I'm not mistaken, it started during the pandemic. And the matter of the mobile payment in China exists for over 10 years. It started in 2014 when the 4G was popularized in China, so we started using mobiles. But we compare Pix in Brazil, which makes our life much easier. If we compare to the Chinese payments, I'd like to make a comparison. Pix makes payment easier, but in China, our app is called Super App. So it works a little bit more of as an ecosystem. So if Pix is a road for the payment, I believe our app called WeChat and Alipay, both of them are like a CDOS for the whole transportation. So WeChat and Alipay, they serve us in payment, in social life, the government payments, the social security, gas, electricity, taxi, all the functions work inside a single app. So we don't have to download all those apps to operate all that. So this is one of the things that I miss in from China, and there is this convenience, extreme convenience to do all these things in a single app. Yes, and I use it when I go to China. I use Alipay, and you do it everything. You do it all. You pay for your train, your airplane ticket. You book a hotel. You do everything. And we are also starting to see in Brazil the arrival of the delivery apps from China, because Alipay is an ecosystem with several apps inside of it. So Meituan, which is a delivery app that is getting to Brazil. It's a new brand. So Meituan is inside Alipay. And what I heard of amazing stories when I was in China is that you can be in the Great Wall, and if you want a hot pot, you can order on the app, and the drone will get to you on the Great Wall. So if you are on a fast train going from a city to another and you want to eat something, you order on the app, and before getting to the station, when the train stops at the station, the delivery guy is at the door and he gives it to the um, stewardess, and they will deliver to your seat. So it's the convenience and the delivery of online shopping that arrives in hours. So it's really something. Yes, also, you mentioned the internet connection at the Great Wall, and we went to Tibet for following up someone on the Everest in 5,000 meters. It was snowing and 5G was working perfectly. It was great. We just missed ordering some food for being delivered by a drone. And I think that China is evolving so fast that me as a Chinese person, it's hard for me to keep up. So I go back to China every year, once or twice a year. And I remember there was a year I got back and I could pay with the palm of my hand. And now I know that I'm going to go back to China and I can pay just by looking at a camera. So it's the reading of my eye. So every year it changes. And as Claudia mentioned, the picture of you live in Beijing and all the buildings. I remember one year I got back to my neighborhood and everything was different. Where is the park I played when I was a child? Didn't exist anymore. It was a hospital. So every year it's different. And Yili, you spent half of your life in China and half of your time in Brazil.
Pois é, já estou passando muito tempo no Brasil, já posso me considerar um meio brasileira. Se um dia eu conseguir falar R certinho.
One day, if I can say the R's correctly, then I'll consider myself a Brazilian. But the longer I live in Brazil, more things actually become surprising to me, such as some perceptions of Brazilians that I wasn't aware about. Some things I've already mentioned. One of them, actually, I created a list. So one of the things that they say is every Chinese person looks the same. Guys, my students and Chinese friends are here. Take a look. Do you think that they look the same? China has a lot of different ethnicities, and each one has a different culture, different language. So within China, we have a lot of diversity. And what I don't understand sometimes is when people ask me, how do I differentiate Chinese and Japanese people? Everyone has that same question. I have the same question. So, how would you differentiate someone from the US and Canada or Portuguese and Spaniards? It's hard. But this is not what truly bothers me. What bothers me is that you might not ask that. That if you ask that, it's not a problem. But what usually happens when I'm walking in the street in Brazil, someone sees me and they say, "Oh, someone like Eastern," and they start saying "arigato," "sayonara," and I'm sure every single Eastern person living in Brazil goes through that. And before, I thought that only Chinese people were bothered by that. But actually, just the other day, I posted on my stories about this topic, and I received a lot of direct messages from Japanese descendants who were born in Brazil. They have the Japanese origins, but they have already been called, little Japanese, or people say arigato and sayonara for them. And they said that it also bothers them. So sometimes I believe that Brazilians would like to do something nice and kind of be friendly, but it ends up being something that is uncomfortable. And I think it's important for this to happen. Yeah, it's a stereotype. Exactly. And I think it's important to bring awareness to the fact that maybe this could be funny to some of you, but we don't see it as funny. So if you can also share this with your friends, family members, I would really appreciate it. What else? That was the first thing. And the second thing is that people say, oh, Chinese people only work, but they don't know how to enjoy their life. So, guys, I went to my friend's wedding in Thailand. We were there for a lot of days, but I brought you some data that in 2019, Chinese people had 105 million trips abroad, spending over $127 billion as leaders in the world. So today, China has the biggest tourism market in the world. And Claudia can confirm it's the biggest international consumption group all over the world. Wherever you go, you see Chinese people, buying at very luxurious stores. And one of the reasons that I think it's important to say is because China was able to incentivize domestic tourism, is what Claudia said about the high-speed trains. This evolution of high-speed trains was a factor. Claudia already talked about how short the time is between Beijing to Shanghai, only 4 hours. And just so you know, when I was young, my grandmother lived in a city close to Beijing. And when I visited her from Beijing back to Shanghai, we took at least 14 hours to drive and only 4 hours now. And another point of comparison, if one day Brazil has high speed trains from Campinas to Sao Paulo on the same speed that China has today in the trains from Campinas to Sao Paulo, the high speed train would make the trip in how long? 20 minutes. 20 minutes. And it costs around, for this trip, it costs around 100 reais today. So we have a concept in China, which is if you want to make a region prosper, first you should build a path. And that's exactly what Claudia was talking about. Yes, that's a pre-requirement, right, for growth. Exactly. And do I still have time? Okay. And the next one, the next misconception that I listed is that they say that Chinese people are cold. Yeah, they're really not. I think Claudia can share a little bit of her experience in that aspect because she lived in China for a long time in Beijing. And I wanted to have a point of comparison, which is the following. I believe that I lived in China half my life and Brazil half my life, but I think that Chinese people are just as warm as Brazilians. However, our way of showing is different. In Brazil, I believe that Brazilians' love language is hugging, kissing, and actually there is a word that doesn't exist in Chinese that I love, which is it's like a head massage in Portuguese. It's called cafuné. So, warm words. When you meet your friends, you hug them. That's the Brazilian way. And Chinese people, and when you have your first contact, it doesn't work like that. We usually respect your personal space. For example, in China, if you go into an elevator, we don't say hello to anyone. Because if I say hello to Claudia, who was already there and I don't know her, maybe, I'm going to feel like I'm bothering her, I'm intruding into her space. So we do have this point of respecting other people's space. And what is our way of showing love? Our love language is mainly in actions. So we'll bring you food, we'll ask if you need anything, and if you do, I can help you with that. Do you need money? I can lend you money. So basically, it's based on actions. We consider that actions speak louder than words. And that's why I believe there is a difference. So if one day you travel to China, you can try it. Maybe no Chinese people will say hello or smile to you, but if you touch a person and you say, "Hey, I'm lost. Can you help me?" You can be 100% sure that you're going to receive collective help all of a sudden. One person is going to come. Maybe they can't explain anything to you. Then we'll have more people, and you're going to create a huge group, and everyone is trying to help you. That's how we operate, really. And Claudia, you can attest to that with your experience. Yes. And on the book that I wrote, I actually talked about that. I said that the Chinese are the Latinos of Asia. I think that they're very warm. And thinking about, the Chinese only work aspect, I think it's an amazing experience to go to China and walk in public spaces in the city, especially parks. You're going to see groups of Chinese that are doing Tai Chi together, singing, dancing, playing ping pong, playing any kinds of games. And one thing that was really incredible to me, and it wasn't just Beijing or Shanghai, even in the countryside cities that I went to, people are dancing. Someone brings a boombox, and outdoors, they just start to have like a party. And I saw that a lot in Beijing, especially in the Hohai region. But even in the countryside, I saw that. So I would say there's a lot of community. People do things together and they really are present in these public spaces. I also think that it's important for us to raise historical context, like Claudia was saying. The entire part of the suffering that China went through during the Opium War, Second World War as well. My grandmother nowadays is 96 years old and she witnessed all of that. She witnessed everything. So she has told me at the time the biggest concern that they had in life was having food for one day, not even one meal. It was having, food for a day. So no one was thinking about traveling, enjoying life because the number one need was survival. So, whenever we ask these types of questions or we look at some attitudes from Chinese people, it's important for us to think about this historical context. For sure, yes. And also the history, being aware of the weight that history bears, I think is very important when we talk about China. This awareness of the long history that China has, the connection to the past, it's truly really important. Well, I think it's time to hear from all of you. Felipe, are we correct? Yes, let's hear it for them. Now we get to the questions. So this is when you can ask them questions. Here in Campinas, you can ask questions. You have a paper, you can write it down and I'll read it. If you want to ask your question, you can raise your hand and someone will come to you. And there are some questions that we've already received from the YouTube audience. So we're going to start with a question by Mariana Moraes. She is asking, with the advancement of Chinese companies in Brazil, can we also expect an increase in Chinese population in Brazil? So her question is Brazil ready to live with a culture that is so different? Well, I think both of us can reply to this one. I believe that first of all, I want to talk about the arrival of Chinese companies in Brazil. One thing that I kind of skipped in the presentation because our time was coming to an end is precisely the fact that China over the last decade has also came out as a big investor in other countries. China would really receive a lot of investment from other countries. But starting in 2016, they started investing more abroad rather than receiving abroad investment. And Brazil has a very important position as a destination of Chinese investment. We have a database that is called China Global Investment Tracker. You can follow Chinese investments all over the world, and they have data since 2008. And from 2008 until now, when you look at the stock of investments that China has done in this period, Brazil is the fourth largest destination of investments, only behind the US, Australia, and England. And the electricity sector is the sector that has been receiving the most Chinese investment here in Brazil, then the oil sector. And we've seen a lot from the council, the Brazil China Council. We have research every year from Chinese investments in the country. And what we've seen is, in fact, a growth in the investments that are coming in any kinds of green industries. So, wind and solar energies, electrical cars. And another trend that we see as well is IT. So, we see that the Chinese investments are already happening in Brazil and they have been stronger ever since 2010 here. So, we've had around 15 years of history with Chinese companies investing in Brazil. We can already see the arrival of Chinese executives in Brazil. And as far as I know, and I think that CPFL is an example of that, I believe that Chinese and Brazilians get along really well, actually. Talking about business management, what do you think? Well, I completely agree with Claudia. I would like to say that I see Brazil as a country that is very diverse, and it's a very inclusive country that embraces people from all over. And there is a quote, I think it's from Brazil, that I agree, which is the best of Brazil is Brazilians. So basically, you've already received Italians, Germans, Japanese people, so why not the Chinese? And today, for example, I have students that study Mandarin and they work in Chinese companies. So they study Mandarin to try to get closer to the Chinese colleagues. And at the same time, we have my students here who are Chinese that are actively learning Portuguese. So in a little bit, after we finish the meeting, if you want to say hello to them and if you want to encourage them to speak more Portuguese, feel free because they are a little bit shy. This is something that, they may not understand, but you can go say hi to them if you can. And I think that this interaction is very interesting. There's just one thing that I would like to say, something that happened today. One of the Chinese students asked me a question that actually made me a bit embarrassed, which is how am I going to explain to him? That's what I thought. He said, every time I say the word frango or flango, people laugh at me. And he asked, does the word flango have a different meaning other than the meat itself? And I said, no, there isn't. But it's because in Brazil, there is an ongoing joke that in our language, we don't have the R, the vibrating R sound from frango. So we become a character that's very famous in Brazil called Cebolinha, which changes the R sound for the L sound. But I said, don't worry if you're laughing because you're speaking their language. You're already making maximum effort. So continue, keep going, continue on. And our accent may seem a little funny. And if you could maybe encourage them, maybe not laugh about the flango issue, that's going to be great. There's a question in that's actually recorded from Marcos Caramaru. He's an ex-ambassador from Brazil and China. So, Claudia, I wanted to hear what is your opinion about the real commitment that the Chinese people have with sustainability and fighting climate change? They've evolved a lot in the equipments related to wind energy, solar energy, and it seems that they are committed to this process of fighting climate change. But with the exit of the Americans, with the entire international reality, do you believe that this commitment is going to be maintained? Do you believe that the commitment is, in fact, a firm commitment and that China will not back down from it? Marcos, great to see you. Thank you for the question. I believe that China does have a very solid commitment towards the Paris Accord, the institutional architecture that was globally created to deal with climate change and its issues. And I believe that something that is very important for us to highlight is that there's no people who are denying things in the Chinese government. The Chinese government is very clear on the threat that global warming presents. So climate change has been manifesting itself within China through climate events, extreme climate events, just like we see in many other countries. And I think that China is putting a lot of incentives to maintain their climate commitments. And the first one is an economical commitment. As I said here, China is a country that is a global leader in several of the technologies that are in fact essential for decarbonization and energy transition. These industries already represent around 10% of the Chinese GDP. And as I said, China recently was responsible for 60% of global investments that were applied into new energy sources. And other than that, I believe that China, given the expansion that China is going through with wind energy, solar energy, using electric cars and batteries, China is currently able to reach its climate goals much earlier than what was predicted and the deadlines. So China has a goal, for example, of getting to a total of wind and solar energy generation until 2030, which is around 1,200 gigawatts. And as I've stated in the presentation, China has already reached 1,700 gigawatts, so 5 years before the deadline. And as a goal, they want to reach their peak of emissions in 2030. However, there is already evidence that the emissions have started to drop in 2025, which would maybe have an anticipation of this goal as well. And other than that, I believe there is a very clear political commitment in the fact that there is a thought process from Xi Jinping and his vision for China, which is what he calls an ecological civilization. So, building an ecological civilization where the sustainability issue is central. So, I believe China will maintain its commitment, and I believe that the exit of the United States from the Paris Accord actually increases the responsibility of countries such as China and Brazil. So a question from the audience, please state your name and ask your question. My name is Wilson. The question is towards Claudia. I really liked your book, Os Chineses, but it's from 2009. When are we going to have a follow-up? Sorry, is that it? Okay. So, Wilson, I always say to myself, I need to write another book. I need to write another book because, China in 2009 was different. It was a completely different country. So I believe some things in the book haven't changed. And it's the part that I'm talking about, the furthest past history of China, the past before economic reforms, the millenary story and history that we have, Confucianism, Taoism, and the entire imperial history of China that is incredible. But I do need to update it, and I'm going to put that on my New Year's resolutions actually to write a new book, and I'm very happy that you like it.
We have another question from the audience. Please introduce yourself and ask your question. So, good evening. I'm Michael. And in terms of China, there is something that bothered me for a while, and maybe asking that in this opportunity, this may help us. And so it's easier to get to it now. So to contextualize, there is a small part in the Communist Manifesto in Marx that he writes in the middle of the 19th century, and he talks about the state in this capitalist society being a petit comité to manage the interests of the bourgeoisie. And going back to what you exposed to us today, I keep thinking if in the 21st century, when you talk about superlativity, if for Marx, the state at that moment, as he see the bourgeois state, the petit comité, to manage the interests of the bourgeoisie, if China in the capitalist nation scenario isn't it the opposite of that? Is a superlative committee, a democratic system, contrary to what Marx said, not to manage the interests of the bourgeois, but to manage the interests of the people. So even isn't it completely the opposite of what Marx says of the bourgeois state? Can you help me think of that? I say democratic model to manage the interests of the people. So the Communist Party in China, the narrative of the Communist Party in China is that they have a democratic system. that reflects the vision of the population. So they have a hierarchical model to choose their leadership from the rural villas to the counties and the province, and then you get up to having the central leadership. China, it's a way of organizing the party. The party is a Marxist-Leninist party. The saying that shows in the poster in the picture of 78 is a saying that can show in any poster today, adding long live Xi Jinping's thinking, because I think what I said is that the view of the party hasn't changed as something that is central to the Chinese society. And as a Leninist party, it is avant-garde on the society. And I think that besides all that, there are 1,000 discussions in terms of democracy or non-democracy, but one thing I think is important is that the Chinese leadership tries to respond to the expectations, to meet the expectations of the population, and the way the party legitimizes its presence in the power is through economic growth and prosperity. And it's also connected to that an emphasis that became bigger for Xi Jinping in the ideology, and it's an ideology that is not just communist but nationalist. So the emerging China, its emphasis on history, the recovery of Confucianism that for a period, in Mao's period, it was demonized. So there is a reconnection to the ancient history of China, because I think the idea of legitimacy in China is very different from the idea of legitimacy in the Western world. So I think it's important to understand that to be able to understand the Chinese political system. One more question in video by Larissa Vlachos. She is an expert in China. Hi, Claudia. I'd like to ask you, considering all your experience, what do you think a country like Brazil could take as a lesson, as a learning from the history of the economical development and the capacity of planning of China? Larissa, my dear, I met her when I used to live in Beijing, and we coexisted there for a while, and we did many things together in China, and she's a big expert in China. I think the first lesson to China from Brazil is the strategic planning for the long term and knowing how to insert in the world, have a strategy for being a part of the world. China started to open up in 1978, but today China is more integrated in the world economy than Brazil. We talked a lot about exports here, about China being the biggest exporter in the world, but it's also a great importer. It's the second largest importer in the world. And China is very integrated in different productive chains in the world. And I think another lesson connected to that is the capacity to update its strategies. As we saw, the reform was not something overnight that followed a single script. The script was updated over time, and the main mechanism to update its scripts of development are the 5-year plans, during which the Chinese leadership defines the strategy for the next 5 years. And 2025 concludes the 14th five-year plan. And another lesson that Ini mentioned is the emphasis on education. China invested a lot in education the last 4.5 decades. Many Chinese students went to the US to study. I went to the US, I had my master's in the US, and many of my classmates were Chinese. Even Trump, the main nationality of students in the US was China. It was above India. So you had those in Australia, in Canada, in Europe too. So this emphasis on education reflects on the technological development and innovation in China. It has many engineers, and there is a book that was just launched of a Chinese Canadian, someone born in China that lives in Canada, done one called Breakneck. And he compares, he says that China is a engineers society and the US is a society of lawyers. And the US stopped building things and China, the engineering in China is something impressive. So if we look at the whole leadership, the recent leadership in China, they are engineers. So it is the country that is building. And the US is the country that today discusses legal matters. And China today has one of the best universities in the world, the University of Beijing, of Tsinghua, of 81. And something that I find very important about China, sometimes in Brazil, I think there is some care, especially in public universities. I think it changed a lot. I studied USP, and back then it was a little bit like that, is that there is a strong connection between China, in China, between university and the industry, in research, because it's important to transform research in product, in service, in something that exists. And the amount of investment in research and development, not only by the state, but also by the companies, is very high. And the last lesson I would mention is the pursuit to alternative technological paths. So China, the development of electric cars, for example, in China, meets a matter of decarbonization, but it was a decision by the Chinese leadership when they concluded that the leadership in combustion cars was with the European, Japanese, and American companies. So it would be very hard for China to catch up with that technology. So they decided to invest on a different technological path, the electric cars, and it worked. 5G, China is the country that has the most patents for 5G in the world, and it became a global reference in 5G. So having this perception of alternative paths that can be traced. We have one more question from the audience in the corner. I'm Eduardo, and I would like to know how you see, going back to what Michael mentioned, how you see the role of the Chinese tradition, the Confucianism, and other practices of collective coexistence. How does it impact, and what is the role of all that to introduce Marxism and Leninism in China, and how it is articulated in a society when you see practices that we would associate as a collective way of existence, and here in the Western world we would see in a different way, but it's something that is more rooted in the Chinese structure, and it's part of a society that is before all that. Do you want to reply? I've never thought so much about that. What I can say is that when the Communist Revolution took place and Mao Tsé-tung got to the power, that past was seen in a very negative way. The new Chinese leadership talked about the past, the imperial past, as the feudal submissive period. So initially, and I believe that for a while, there wasn't the identity between the new government in China, the communist government in China, and its past, its Confucianist past. But in recent years, we see a rehabilitation of Confucius. There is a new value added to Confucius. At some point, there was a statue of Confucius in front of a museum in China, but then I think they took it off because it is a controversial topic. But I think the matter of the collective over the individual, I believe you can see it in China. The matter of thinking of the society, of the country, and when I use the Chinese dictionary, there are many examples of phrases connected to how the country was built and phrases with a nationalist meaning that may have a strong connection to Confucius. I think, as Claudia mentioned, our education from the beginning is directed, is guided for us to think in the collective. So we always say that the collective is above the individual. So the word country in Chinese is country plus family. So the country is before the family. So we first think of a Pacific country for us to have our family in peace. So whenever the concept of collective is taught at schools, all the activities are involved for us to think of that. And there's also the matter of the tradition. Today, I see that young people in our generation and even younger people are value even more our tradition. For example, my clothes today, they are traditional in China, and maybe some time ago, Chinese people wouldn't want to wear the traditional clothes. They wanted to wear modern, chic clothes. But today, more young people are using the traditional clothes and following traditions that were not valued some time ago. So I really see a change. Yes, and I believe that for a while, during the reform period, there was this aspiration of changing the way of living, the clothes, and now not only coming back to valuing the tradition, I think China, one of the elements of the new phase that is starting now in the Chinese development is the fact that China is being identified with Chinese brand products. We didn't know Chinese brands before, and now we can buy a BYD or GWM cars. So Akita delivery is starting to operate in China. So we have Xiaomi for mobile phones. So we have Xiaomi that's arrived too, or Oppo. So we have drinking stores, Michue, that is investing in Brazil too. So I think this reflects the fact that, of course, I'm forgetting Labubu, of course, the Labubu that is a phenomenon. Can you tell us what labubu is? Me, as a Chinese person, I still don't understand everything that's going on about that. Labubu is it's a doll, it's a Chinese doll that became a phenomenon worldwide. There were speculation on that, and it's something new. I think this new phase is the phase of China with brand and their own products. So there will be the Chinese Nike or cars or Labubu or the other things that will come up. A question from the audience, please. Good evening, Claudia and Yili. My question is in the economic sense for Claudia, and then one for Yili as well. From the future perspective point of view, in terms of economy, how do you assess the risks and the benefits for Latin countries, especially Brazil, to have more alignment with China, which would be for short and midterms, the changes and the benefits in the economic and the social point of view? And then I would like to know from Yili how you see the idea of the Chinese that is in China, how they see the position of the state in the life of the Chinese. Thank you. So I'm going to take the economic question, and Yili is going to answer the second part. China has increased its presence, its investments in Latin America. Latin America is a very important region for supplying commodities and raw material to China. It is a source of ore, of copper, of lithium, and it is an extremely important region for food safety for China. China is the main food importer in the world, and Brazil is, with the commercial war started by Trump in the beginning of his first mandate in 2017-18,
Brazil took the position that belonged to the United States as the main export of produce to the US. So 25% of what China buys in terms of meats and that kind of product comes from Brazil. And Argentina is also a very big supplier of different crops. And I think that the risk that exists is the fact that we are in the Americas. So we have inescapable geography. We are in the American continent. The US is a very important country in the region for several different reasons than China. The US is also a very important investor in Brazil, in the whole region. There is always a financial connection between Brazil and the United States that is very strong, and this does not exist between Brazil and China. So when we think about the capital market, the banking market, there is a very strong connection there. And I believe that the best case scenario for Brazil and the risk for Brazil, and it's not only a risk for Brazil, but actually a risk to all countries that are not the United States, is basically being pushed into making a choice between the United States and China. And I believe this would be a very hard position to be put in. But I hope and I believe that we're not going to get to that point. And I believe that the ideal thing for a country such as Brazil would be to maintain good relationships with both countries, because both countries are extremely relevant. Okay, so my turn. I hope I understood the question correctly. You were asking, as a Chinese person, how do I see the position of the state and the government in Chinese people's lives? So before anything else, I see that Chinese people have a lot of respect for authority. I think Claudia already mentioned the hierarchy a little bit. We respect authority a lot, not only the government authority, but the authority within a company or a boss. And within the school, the authority is the teacher. And actually, I always say to everyone that in China, you have two kinds of people that are very respected. One is the masters, so the teachers, and the other ones are the elderly people because they've lived so long, they've seen so much, they have a lot of experience, and we have to look at them as authorities. So we do respect the government as an authority. And I have to say that due to my education, I'm very much a patriot. If I talk too much about China, I'll start crying. But the entire history that Claudia talked about, the evolution of China in the last 4 decades, is incredible. As a Chinese person, I'm very proud of everything that my grandmother, my mother, and myself have lived throughout this time. And why do we trust and respect our authority or government now? It's because as Chinese people, we live well. And what do you consider to live well? In China, we have absolute safety. As a woman, I can go in the middle of the night with my phone in my hand with a $1,000 purse, and no one is going to rob me. And actually, we have foreign people who don't believe that, so they test and have like social experience. I'm telling you to do that. You leave your phone in the middle of the train station. If you go back 1 hour later, your phone will still be there. So I consider the first thing is to live safety. That to me is living well. And the second thing is convenience. So all of the technologies that China is developing that can help improve our everyday life. When we have these kinds of commercial wars and worldwide world wars, we usually say, what do Chinese people think about this, everything that's happening? Are they worried? And then you have people dancing in the squares with their boombox and having their dance parties. Everyone is living in peace and tranquility. So I believe that if the government is able to provide that to our people, this is what we're looking for. Because sometimes I see that some Brazilians criticize a lot their authorities here in Brazil. And as Chinese people, we think, oh, but if you criticize them this way, this is something that we don't do. Because if you want to have a complaint, you have official ways to do that. You can send a letter or an email instead of just complaining. So we do have other paths to take for solutions. So that's why myself as a Chinese, I'm very happy in China and in Brazil. Claudia and Yili, this is the time when we take a look at what we have, and we have a talk that is connected to today. So we're going to show you a piece and you can comment. China has a philosophical apparatus and ideological apparatus, a Confucian ethics that's also legalist and Taoist of valuing the importance of authority. And this comes in every single government, but not in a culturalist way. I'm trying to say this in a pragmatic way. Governments use this as an ideological apparatus. They use this Confucian ethics and they put this in the school curriculums because this is a legacy that values that we have to respect the central authority, the main authority. And once we respect the main authority, we trust, we have to trust, and things are going to be okay. It's much more complex than that, but it is a millenary legacy that values authority. And we can only have peace, harmony, and balance if you respect the authority and you don't go against it or ask questions about the authority. But the Western model is the opposite. You constantly contest authority in the American model. Well, I think what she said is totally related to the question you asked. Sorry, I don't remember your name. You asked the question about Confucianism. I think she talked a little bit about that now. But I think that the impression that she is putting forth, talking about authority and order, is basically projecting an image of China as a society that is much more orderly than it actually is. So, China is not a society that is completely strict. There is a dose of chaos in everyday life in China. There is a dose of, elbowing each other. You see that no one respects lines. Even now, even though the government has had a lot of campaigns for Chinese people to respect lines and cues, and they don't, and they never will. I remember that when I got there in 2004, it was a campaign to make it so pedestrians would stop when there was a red light to cross. And the traffic was chaos. So cars, motorcycles, bikes, and horns. So I remember that I was there waiting one day, and there were two guards that would basically extend a yellow line when the line was closed to stop people from crossing. And people would go under this line, and the guards would complain. People would say, and they would just keep going. So I do think that China has this Confucian influence, but they also have other influences such as Taoism, and there are other aspects that make it so society is not as, correct and orderly as people can imagine. Yeah, actually, I think that the comment about the video is the same answer that I provided to, sorry, what's her name? Bruno. Yes, I think that's it. Another question from our audience. Please go ahead, state your name and ask your question. Hello, good evening. My name is Wilson, and I wanted to basically say more of a statement than a question. I have been to China 3 times for professional reasons, and there were a lot of interesting things that happened on my trips to China. And I wanted to mention one of the things that I thought was amazing that I believe goes hand in hand with what was said here about, the relationships, and Yili said about the people and the respect that they have. During the flight that we were switching planes, had a connection in the United States. We missed the flight. So I missed the flight, and there was a Chinese couple that also missed the flight with me. They were together, but they couldn't say a word in English. And then the person from the airline told me, "Can you help? Can you help the couple?" Because the flight was going to only depart in 24 hours. I didn't speak Chinese, and I said, "Okay, I can help." So I was able to convince them to follow me. We went to the hotel. We took a bus to go to the hotel. We got to the hotel, and then we got to the other side. They wanted to thank me somehow. They wanted to thank what I was doing for them. So they took me to a Chinese restaurant in the US. And then I said the name of a beer, and I've never seen that much beer in front of me after I said the name. And they would bring beers constantly for me. So then we slept in the hotel the next day. I helped them trying to explain that we needed to get transport to go back to the airport. I took them back. I pretty much put them inside the plane, and we went to Beijing. When we got to Beijing and was reaching for my bag, and this lady came and started talking to me and talking to me, and I didn't understand anything. And a Chinese person came and explained, "They're going to take you to your hotel. So grab your suitcase and follow them." And then I found out that this couple, he was one of the billionaires in China. He had his car parked in the parking lot for 2 months. They took me, they gave me a tour of Beijing at night. She was talking nonstop, explaining what has happened during the Olympics. They took me to the hotel. She got down from the car. She made sure to walk me to the check-in of the hotel, see if everything was okay, gave me their card, and made it clear. And the people translated for me. Whatever you need in China, you can talk to him at any time. Whatever you need, you got it. So it really was them returning a favor that it was a simple favor that I was doing for them. So on these trips, I truly fell in love with the Chinese people, the Chinese food, and also the way that they live. And I just wanted to add a comment about Claudia. You were just mentioning on the last thing you said, four things: strategic planning, long-term strategic planning, 4 words. That's my dream for Brazil. Unfortunately, it probably dies with me, but that was it. It was just a comment. Thank you. Yeah, I do think it would be great if we would be able to get that.
Feliz também em ouvir essa
I
história.
was very happy hearing your story, and I believe we have a proverb that says
Visitar uma vez é melhor do que ouvir
hearing it one or visiting it one time is better than hearing about it 1,000 times. So I invite all of you, if you haven't been to China, make sure to go and have an experience like our friend Wilson, and I'm sure you're going to have an amazing experience. Yili and Claudia, now is the time that I don't want to, I don't want to say this, but we've reached the end of Café Filosófico. The conversation was amazing tonight, but I won't finish before going over to you guys one last time. If you want to have your final words, go ahead.
Eu acho assim, quando a gente
Well,
falar da
I
China,
believe that
China,
when we
às vezes
when we talk about China, or sometimes we criticize China, we think about China, it's really important to think about the historical context and keep it in mind,
nossa perspectiva histórica,
trying to understand it from our historical perspective. So, for example,
de setembro
I made a video saying that September 3rd, 2025, now there was a parade, a military parade in China to celebrate the win against the win in World War II against fascism. And during the time of this war, for example,
chineses foram mortos,
35 million Chinese people were either killed or wounded. So we went through a period of humiliation and suffering. So it's really important when you talk about China to consider everything we've been through. So I believe that the central goal and the what people want is to have revitalization. We want to rebuild our country. We want to eliminate poverty and also making sure that we will never experience that weakness and humiliation again that we experienced during that time. So I believe that all of these actions that Claudia talks about today,
também a defesa
so economical
e também a preservação
growth, defending national superiority, and having social stability. For all of this, we always need to think and understand and consider given the historical context. So I count on all of your understanding about China.
mais uma vez, muito obrigada por
And also, once again, thank you so much for the invitation and for being here at Café Filosófico for CPFL.
tudo e também essa é a minha primeira
It's an initiative that I really admire, and this is my first time in Campinas, and I'm really enjoying it. Thank you so much. Ili, I think you're absolutely correct. Like we said, the weight of the history of China is very heavy, and China does have a history of pretty much over a century that was very traumatic. It is history that very few countries have been through what China has been through. And today, China has a successful story. And I'm sure that if we come together in 2 or 3 years to talk about China, we're going to have even more new things to talk about because the rhythm of transformation and change in China is actually remarkable. And at the same time, it's the contradiction. It's a country that changes. However, there is something, there is the Chinese identity, the Confucianism, Taoism. This has always been maintained. And we see that when we go to parks and we see people practicing Tai Chi together. You see that there is, in fact, something that is in memoriam. So it doesn't change, even though there's a lot of economical transformation that happens at a rapid pace. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for the invitation. It was great being at Café Filosófico CPFL. Thank you. Claudia, Yili, thank you so much. I only have one word for you. I think it's actually two, which is 谢谢. I think it's thank you very much. That's all my Chinese does. Maybe I'll pick up some classes with you later. Thank you so much. But truly, thank you so much for your talk. It was amazing to listen to this true class. And we're now finishing the China module for this month at Café Filosófico. Next week, we're going to start another module about climate anxiety. So next Thursday, we're going to have Marco Aurelio Bilibio talking about climate anxiety. And now we're done with Café Filosófico, but for you guys who are here in Campinas, we have a little bit more, and you can take pictures with our speakers from today. So I'll just ask you to please organize a line on the side as soon as we're done, and we'll get started with the picture session. Feel free to tag us in your social media, and we'll see you next week. On Sunday, Tai Chi is a lot of things. It's a martial art, it's a medicine practice, it is a practice of Chinese philosophy. Tai Chi Chuan as a port, a door to the Chinese culture. After you've practiced for a while, you start to notice that what we started for an individual reason starts to be taken care of by a community. In the martial arts tradition, there are teachings of masters that know proverbs and they teach about Tai Chi or about tradition or ancestrality by using proverbs. Café Filosófico on Sunday at 9 p.m.